When most people think of Sauron, they think of the great and wandering eye, a towering, fiery gaze searching relentlessly from the heart of Mordor. But in reality, you don't know him at all. While many remember him as a dark tyrant commanding vast armies of orcs, Sauron's true genius lay not on the battlefield, but behind it. Long before armies marched and swords were drawn, he was already shaping the outcome of the war before it even started. He manipulated kings, corrupted entire civilizations, infiltrated his enemies, spread paranoia across Middle-earth, and spent centuries executing plans so intricate that most of his opponents never realized they were trapped until it was too late. His victories were built on deception, intelligence, psychological warfare, and patience. Time and again, Sauron proved himself to be one of the greatest military and political strategists in the history of Middle-earth. A mastermind who sought to conquer his enemies before a single battle was ever fought. We're going to be breaking down the entire military genius of Sauron and exploring the strategies that nearly allowed him to dominate Middle-earth, not once, oh no, but twice. Most know that he served as Morgoth's chief lieutenant throughout the First Age, but what most don't know is that Morgoth wasn't your typical evil guy. Oh no, Morgoth was not merely evil by the standards of Middle-earth, he was evil on a cosmic scale. A blazing nihilist hell-bent on all destruction. If Morgoth didn't make it, Morgoth wanted it destroyed. And after Morgoth's ousting by the Valar at the end of the First Age, Sauron went into hiding out of pride and shame. One can only imagine how, if Morgoth was a teacher to Sauron, he shaped his protege. So to properly understand Sauron's military genius, it's important to understand where he learned it. During the First Age, Sauron spent centuries serving under Morgoth, witnessing some of the largest and most devastating wars ever fought in Middle-earth. While Morgoth relied heavily on brute force and overwhelming destruction, Sauron learned something far more valuable. Victory could be achieved long before the battle itself. This made him an entirely different opponent to his infamous master. For example, throughout the Wars of Beleriand, Sauron was entrusted with significant responsibilities. He commanded the fortress of Tol Garroth, ruled vast territories on behalf of Morgoth, and oversaw networks of spies, servants, and monsters. Unlike many of Morgoth's other lieutenants, Sauron was not simply a warrior. He was an administrator, organizer, and planner. He learned how to maintain supply lines, coordinate distant forces, gather intelligence, and exploit weaknesses within enemy alliances. These experiences would become the foundation of every major campaign he later conducted. By the year 1000 in the Second Age, Sauron had established himself in the land of Mordor and begun laying the foundations of his future empire. Having inherited much of Morgoth's former power and many of his servants, he gathered scattered orc tribes, trolls, and other evil creatures beneath his banner. He also forged alliances with the Easterlings and Haradrim, offering them wealth, power, and the promise of conquest. Yet Sauron understood something that many conquerors throughout history have failed to grasp. Military force alone rarely secures lasting victory. Before he sought to conquer his enemies on the battlefield, he sought to weaken them politically. This became the defining principle of Sauron's strategy. Rather than attacking his enemies directly, he preferred to corrupt them from within. A perfect example of this would be when he assumed the beautiful and noble form of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He approached the elves of Eregion not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. He gained the trust of Celebrimbor and the Gwaith y Myrdain, sharing knowledge of craftsmanship and magic while secretly advancing his own plans. Through deception rather than warfare, he positioned himself at the heart of one of the most powerful elven realms in Middle-earth. The creation of the Rings of Power was not merely an act of sorcery, it was one of the most successful intelligence and influence operations in world history. Sauron had effectively infiltrated his enemies' leadership and manipulated them into helping create the very tools he would later use to dominate them. It demonstrated one of his most consistent military principles: corruption before conquest. At the same time, Sauron was also preparing for future wars. Around 1000 in the Second Age, construction began on Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. Taking 6 centuries to complete, it became the greatest fortress built since the fall of Angband. Strategically positioned near Mount Doom, Barad-dûr served as both a military headquarters and a symbol of Sauron's growing power. From here, he could coordinate armies, direct logistics, and project authority across much of Middle-earth. It was a fortress, and it was oh so mighty. Unlike many rulers who relied upon a single army, Sauron developed a vast military network composed of numerous races and factions. His forces included Orc legions, trolls, warg riders, Easterlings, Haradrim, and eventually the Nazgûl. Each group served a specific purpose. The Easterlings provided disciplined infantry, the Haradrim brought cavalry and war beasts, while the Orcs supplied overwhelming numbers. This diversity allowed Sauron to wage war on an enormous scale and replace losses more easily than his enemies. As his power grew, Sauron increasingly relied on another critical element of his strategy: fear. The Nine Rings transformed mortal kings into the Nazgûl, elite terror weapons designed to collapse enemy morale. Sauron used them to win battles psychologically, as their presence alone caused soldiers to flee and populations to surrender. Beyond serving as terrifying servants, the Ringwraiths were versatile strategic assets, intelligence agents, battlefield commanders, and shock troops. Their mere approach crippled armies and panicked cities, keeping enemy leaders under constant pressure. Sauron recognized that fear multiplied his own force's effectiveness. By making an enemy force doubt itself before combat began, he had already won half the battle. And by the height of the Second Age, Sauron's influence stretched across much of Middle-earth. Yet his ambitions suffered a major setback when the armies of Númenor intervened. In 1700, in the Second Age, King Tar-Minastir defeated Sauron's forces at the Battle of the Gwathlo, forcing him back into Mordor. Most rulers would have viewed this as a devastating defeat, but not Sauron. Sauron treated it as a temporary obstacle. For centuries, he rebuilt his strength, demonstrating another characteristic that defined his strategic thinking: patience. Unlike many villains who sought immediate victory, Sauron was willing to spend centuries preparing for future campaigns. This patience reached its greatest expression in his dealings with Númenor. When King Ar-Pharazôn arrived with an army so vast that resistance was impossible, Sauron surrendered without a fight. Militarily, this appeared to be a humiliation. Strategically, it was a total masterstroke. Taken to Númenor as a prisoner, Sauron gradually corrupted the king and his court from within. Over time, he transformed the most powerful kingdom of men into an enemy of the Valar themselves. Eventually, he convinced Ar-Pharazôn to launch an invasion of Aman in pursuit of immortality. The result was catastrophic. Númenor was destroyed, its fleets annihilated, and its civilization wiped from the map. No battlefield victory could have achieved what Sauron accomplished through manipulation. He had eliminated the greatest military power in the world without fighting a single campaign against it. Following the destruction of Númenor, Sauron returned to Mordor and rebuilt his empire. Though he could no longer assume a fair form, his strategic methods remained unchanged. He continued to rely on fear, overwhelming force, and political division. Perhaps his greatest military strength was his understanding of coalition warfare. He knew that the free peoples were strongest when united. Therefore, he constantly worked to keep elves, dwarves, and men divided. Throughout his career, Sauron sought to isolate his enemies, encourage rivalries, and prevent alliances from forming. This strategy almost succeeded. By the end of the Second Age, he controlled vast portions of Middle-earth and seemed poised for total victory. Only the formation of the last alliance of elves and men disrupted his plans. Gil-galad and Elendil recognized that no individual kingdom could defeat Sauron alone. Their alliance directly countered Sauron's divide-and-conquer strategy. United, they defeated his armies at Dagorlad and laid siege to Barad-dûr for 7 years. Even then, Sauron remained dangerous. He personally entered the battlefield, slew both Gil-galad and Elendil, and nearly turned defeat into victory. Only Isildur's removal of the One Ring destroyed his physical form and ended the war. Yet even this defeat reveals another aspect of Sauron's strategic brilliance. Because he had invested much of his power into the One Ring, his spirit endured after the destruction of his body. While defeated militarily, he survived strategically. His enemies won the war, but failed to eliminate the source of his power. During the Third Age, Sauron once again demonstrated his mastery of long-term strategy. Rather than immediately revealing himself, he spent centuries rebuilding his strength in secret. He established strongholds such as Dol Guldur, rebuilt alliances with men in the east and south, expanded his intelligence networks, and prepared for a future conflict. When the War of the Ring finally began, Sauron employed many of the same principles that had guided him for thousands of years. He launched simultaneous offensives across Middle-earth, attacking Gondor, Dale, Erebor, Lorien, and Mirkwood at roughly the same time. This prevented his enemies from concentrating their forces and forced them to fight on multiple fronts. These offensives were not isolated campaigns. They were part of a larger strategy designed to prevent the Free Peoples from supporting one another. If the dwarves of Erebor had been free to march south, Gondor might have received critical reinforcements. If the elves of Lorien had not been defending their own borders, they could have contributed warriors elsewhere. By forcing every kingdom to fight for its own survival simultaneously, Sauron ensured that no united front could emerge against him. His intelligence network was equally formidable. Through spies, servants, corrupted leaders, and the Palantiri, Sauron gathered information from across Middle-earth. He understood the value of information and often knew more about his enemies than they knew about one another. Even the assault on Minas Tirith reflected this mindset. The city itself was important, but Sauron also viewed the battle as an opportunity to draw attention away from his true concern, the One Ring. Every major military action he launched during the war was shaped by his assumption that his enemies would eventually attempt to wield the ring against him. Ironically, this expectation blinded him to the actual plan unfolding in secret. Ultimately, however, Sauron's greatest strength became his greatest weakness. Because he viewed power as the ultimate goal, he assumed everyone else did as well. He could imagine an enemy using the One Ring against him. He could imagine an enemy claiming it for themselves. What he could not imagine was an enemy willingly destroying it. This single miscalculation led to his downfall. It was a rare failure in an otherwise extraordinary strategic career. For thousands of years, Sauron consistently anticipated how his enemies would think, react, and fight. The destruction of the ring succeeded precisely because it relied upon a choice he considered impossible. Sauron remains one of fantasy's greatest military strategists, not because he won every battle, but because he understood warfare in all its forms. He combined diplomacy, espionage, propaganda, psychological warfare, logistics, fortification, intelligence gathering, and conventional military power into a unified strategy of domination. Again and again, he sought to defeat his enemies before armies ever met on the battlefield. In the end, Sauron was not merely a Dark Lord. He was a master strategist whose greatest victories were achieved not through strength alone, but through patience, manipulation, and an unparalleled understanding of power itself.